So this is Environmental Psychology, Unit 2, Part 1. So what I want to talk about today is cultural psychology. The reason why I like to start out with culture is that it is an important aspect of human cognition. We all are born into a cultural environment, and I like to think of culture as a particular environmental context in which we are born. Some people are born into the North American cultural context. Many of you probably were, and some of you maybe not. And, but all of us have to live day to day interacting with members of a particular culture. We often interact with members of multiple cultures when we travel somewhere or when we go to a particular community of people in different, regions. We're dealing with a new culture, and so that's why I think it's important as a theme in environmental psych. So whereas psychology tends to focus on universal processes, their assumption is that the contents of thought might vary, but not the processes of thought. So, for instance, if you're born in Japan, sure, you speak Japanese, sure, you know a lot about sushi and other things. But in reality, the processes of thought probably are the same in the US and in Japan. But cultural psychologists argue something differently. Okay? And the reason why they do this is that, when we talk about research in psychology, we tend to rely upon research that was conducted at, universities in the United States, mainly state universities, which are very big. And, a lot of these universities, say in Ohio and in Michigan and in Illinois, they're generally serving a white middle class population. Okay, so that's, at the University of Michigan, it is something like 65% Caucasian. In fact, at Rutgers University is the one of the most diverse universities in the United States, so it's a little bit different here. But a study that I did some years ago is to look in a sample of cognitive psychology journals from 2000 to 2005. 82% used college students, and the rest were elderly samples or other populations, studies that were published in, say, Japan or other places in the world. So the idea here is that general psychology is really a very detailed ethnography of predominantly white, middle-class, educated Westerners who happen to be taking Psych 101 and are reluctantly giving up their lunch hour to partially fulfill a course requirement. Some of you may have had to have done that as well, taking research methods or taking intro. You might have to be in experiments, and of course no one wants to be in these experiments, but you do learn a bit about what experimental psych is like. But the point is that, if most of our psychology is based upon samples that are predominantly white, predominantly, middle class, are we really representing a sample that is of what the world's population would look like? And the answer is no. But yet we claim that our findings generalize to the estimated 50 billion humans that have ever existed. So there's that. So cultural psychology is a branch of psychology that questions that. And I always love this quote by a Russian psychologist, A.L. Luria. In order to understand the origin of human thought, one must go outside the organism. One must find the root of all conscious activity in the social and historical forms of human existence. In other words, if we want to understand thought, we have to go outside the individual. We have to look at the history and the society in which an individual lives in order to understand their psychology. I think that could be said clearly of environmental psychology. When we talk about culture, we really can be talking about several things, but two overarching ones are material or objective culture, which has to do with buildings, tools, clothing, methods of transportation. These are the objects that people interact with as part of their culture. And for our culture, we're interacting with things like Wawas, as I said in the last talk. I don't know why I have Wawa in my brain so much, but we're dealing with the New Jersey Turnpike. We're dealing with whatever is part of our local going down the shore, which is very much a Philadelphia area thing to say. If you go out to California, you say we're going down the shore, people are going to look at you very inquisitively. But there's also subjective culture, which is the characteristic way of viewing an environment. So it's the ideas, theories, political, religious, scientific, aesthetic, economic, moral, and social standards for judging events in the environment. And these things are institutionalized in government, education, religion, and so forth. So these things are embedded within these institutions. And so laws are designed in order to create or foster a subjective culture that allows for you to judge the events in the environment. But these are two aspects of culture. This is probably the most famous definition of culture by these two researchers, Kroger and Cluckhorn. Culture consists of patterns, explicit and implicit, of and for behavior acquired and transmitted by symbols, constituting the distinctive achievements of human groups, including their embodiments and artifacts. The essential core of culture consists of traditional, i.e., historically derived and selected ideas and especially their attached values. Cultural systems may, on one hand, be considered as products of action, and on the other, as conditioning elements of further action. So, this is a really great traditional definition from anthropology about what culture is, and so I would be remiss not to provide that definition. I'm sorry about those sounds. That didn't exist before when I did this. But in any case, to define culture, it's a range of activities, phenomena in human life, transmitted from generation to generation as accumulated knowledge, just like language is transmitted from generation to generation. So I always sort of like that idea that, a baby is born and not being able to speak the language that is of its culture, and, but it hears sounds that are produced by adults and begins to internalize them over the course of childhood or infancy and begins to use those symbols themselves, and ultimately developing a vocabulary of some 50,000 words and being able to say an almost infinite number of things, because that's one thing about language, is that there's an infinite number of sentences that are possible out there. So that's a really cool thing, and I think that's sort of like the language and the internalization of language is the first way culture enters the mind. There's socialization and enculturation, how children are socialized and how they're sort of introduced to the culture, and provides implicit and explicit assumptions about life. So, how you are a self is taught by your culture, how to negotiate living in this world. They include shared rules to govern an activity of a group, consisting of patterns of organization, and also the genesis of culture. Where does culture come into view? Does it come out of habit, social interaction, things like that? And that's an issue that is worth doing. And it's also a psychological construct. If I ask you what culture you're from, you're able to sort of identify it. And if I were to ask you, what are some of the rules of your culture? Imagine that you're an Italian American. You might have a bunch of rules that, are about Italian Americans. I'm half Italian, so I often use that example of, frying meatballs or, whatever, not insulting one's mother. But these all get internalized and they become important for who we are. So what cultural psychologists believe is that culture and the mind make each other up. That's a quote by Richard Schwader in 1991. And indeed, cultural practices shape psychological processes, and that leads to divergences in mind and behavior. And these culturally contingent modes of psychological processes are adaptive for surviving within the particular socio-cultural matrix in which individual lives are embedded. So we're born into a particular culture that has different ways of thinking, and those ways of thinking are beneficial for being able to live in that particular culture that we're born into. So that becomes an important issue. So one of the articles that you are reading deals with a distinction that is very important made by a person named Harry Triandis. And so the idea is that ourselves have sides that are both collective and then sides that are individualist. So this dimension of collectivism versus individualism plays an important role in thinking about the self as an agent. And the idea is that certain cultures promote collective self being expressed, and other cultures promote an individual self being expressed, and that ends up being a very interesting dynamic. So the self is universal, but its expression is local. So here are some of the contrasting values, and this, of course, is important for the Mooring article that you're going to read. Aspects of individualism are that the self has independent control, that there are goals for oneself, competition with others, uniqueness is valued, private self-knowledge, direct communication, a consistent self in all situations, and preferring to work alone or do things alone. Whereas collectivism, that promotes relation with a group, a sense of belonging, a duty to the group, harmony with others, advice seeking from others, self alters according to context, hierarchy is important, and prefers working in groups. So if you think about yourself and situations in which you are in, there are probably aspects that you might feel that express your individual side of the self as opposed to the collective side of yourself. So for instance, when you're talking about dinner with family and spending time with family, that's more of the collective side. Whereas, going to work, you very rarely, unless you're Trump, you very rarely bring your children, your adult children, to work. But, that's an aspect of individualism that, you go to work by yourself, and that's important because you need to stand out as a unique individual and compete with others. So all of these things are aspects of the self. And what I like is that, about the Morling article, is that what Beth does is talk about objects in our environment. So physical objects that are manifestations of this kind of self. It's a very interesting read, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. So some things to think about are the distinction of individualism and collectivism, and independent versus interdependent self, and how do we create environments in order to best capitalize on these local differences in self-construal and modes of being. So those are two things to think about as you do these readings.